Robert Mercer's pen hovered over the final signature line of the divorce papers. The mahogany desk in his home office felt cold beneath his palm as afternoon sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the New York skyline beyond. At 52, he had built an empire from nothing, $12 billion worth of hotels, resorts, and real estate developments spanning 3 continents. Now his 6-year marriage to Victoria was ending with the same clinical efficiency with which he conducted business. "Just sign here, Mr. Mercer, and we're done," said Howard Bennett, his attorney of 15 years, pointing to the last empty space on the document. Victoria sat across from him, her posture perfect as always, designer dress impeccable, not a strand of her chestnut hair out of place. She hadn't shed a tear during the entire proceedings. Robert had always admired her composure. It was one of the qualities that had first attracted him to her at the charity gala where they met 7 years ago. Now that same composure made her seem like a stranger. The silence in the room felt oppressive. Their marriage counselor had called it emotional distance. Robert called it the inevitable result of 2 ambitious people who had forgotten why they fell in love. No children to consider, no shared dreams left to pursue. Just the division of assets and the careful extraction of 2 lives that had become too entangled to separate without legal intervention. Victoria gets the Hamptons estate, the apartment in Paris, and the art collection as agreed, Howard continued, flipping through the pages. You retain ownership of Mercer International Holdings and all business assets. The financial settlement has been transferred to her accounts this morning, $40 million, the price of freedom. Less than he'd expected to pay, actually. Victoria could have pushed for more, but she hadn't. Another surprise in a process full of them. Robert lowered the pen to the paper, but before the ink could touch, Victoria spoke. "Wait." Her voice was steady, but something in it made Robert look up. "There's something you should know." The room fell silent. Howard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Can we have a moment alone?" Victoria asked, her eyes never leaving Robert's. Howard glanced at Robert, who nodded. "I'll be right outside," the lawyer said, gathering his papers and stepping out, closing the heavy door behind him. For several seconds after the door closed, neither of them spoke. Victoria's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Whatever composure she'd maintained during the proceedings seemed to be cracking. "What is it, Victoria?" Robert asked, impatience edging his voice. They were so close to the end. Whatever she had to say, couldn't it have waited until after the papers were signed? Victoria took a deep breath. "I've been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer." The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He stared at her, searching her face for any sign that this was some kind of manipulation or tactic. There was none, just the truth, raw and unvarnished, in eyes that suddenly looked tired. "When?" he managed. 2 weeks ago. I didn't want it to affect the divorce proceedings." Robert leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "Why tell me now? Why not after we signed?" Victoria looked down at her hands. "Because you deserve to know before making your final decision. I'm not asking for anything, Robert. The settlement is more than generous. I couldn't let you sign without knowing." Robert stood abruptly, walking to the window. Below, Manhattan continued its relentless pace, oblivious to the earthquake happening in his office. Cancer, the same disease that had taken his mother when he was 12. He closed his eyes, memories washing over him. Hospital corridors, the smell of antiseptic, his father's broken expression. "What's your prognosis?" he asked without turning around. 60% chance of 5-year survival with aggressive treatment. I start chemotherapy next week." Robert turned to face her. "And who's going with you?" Victoria's gaze dropped. "My sister will fly in from Chicago when she can, otherwise I'll manage." "You'll manage," Robert repeated flatly. 6 years of marriage, and this was what they'd come to, strangers managing separate crises. When had they stopped being a team? He returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "Why didn't you tell me when you found out? You made it very clear you wanted this divorce, Robert." "The last thing I needed was your pity, or worse, your obligation." There was a flash of the old Victoria in her eyes, proud, fierce, independent to a fault. "It wouldn't have been obligation," he said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Victoria smiled sadly. "Wouldn't it? We haven't had a real conversation in over a year. You've been in Dubai or Singapore more often than you've been home. The last time we had dinner together, you spent the entire time on your phone. Each word was a precise strike at the truth. Robert couldn't deny any of it. He'd retreated into work as their marriage cooled, using business trips as an excuse to avoid confronting what was happening between them. I don't need your help, Robert, Victoria continued. I just needed you to know. Now you can sign with clear conscience. Robert stared at the papers in front of him. The culmination of months of negotiations. The end of a chapter he'd been eager to close. Now everything felt different. Do you still want this divorce? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Victoria looked startled. Do you? Before he could answer, a knock came at the door. Howard poked his head in. Everything all right? We have another appointment in 30 minutes. We need more time, Robert said firmly, not taking his eyes off Victoria. But the settlement... We'll wait. Thank you, Howard. I'll be in touch. The dismissal was clear. After the lawyer left, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Victoria was the first to break it. I'm not telling you this to trap you, Robert. If you sign those papers, I'll understand. We've both accepted this marriage is over. Robert stood up and walked to the small bar in the corner of his office. He poured 2 glasses of water, bringing one to Victoria. Remember Lake Como? He asked suddenly, handing her the glass. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Our honeymoon. You wanted to rent a boat, but I was on calls all morning with the Tokyo office. He sat on the edge of his desk, closer to her now. By the time I finished, you were gone. I found you on the dock, about to head out with that old Italian man. What was his name? Giuseppe, Victoria said softly. He taught me to fish. I was furious that you'd gone off with a stranger. Robert smiled at the memory. But when you came back, sunburned and smelling like fish, with that huge smile on your face, that was the happiest I'd seen you. Victoria's eyes glistened. Why are you bringing this up now? Because I think that's when it started to go wrong. I should have been on that boat with you. Victoria set her glass down carefully. We can't change the past, Robert. No, he agreed. But maybe the future isn't set in stone either. Before she could respond, Robert's assistant buzzed on the intercom. Mr. Mercer, your 4 o'clock call with the Shanghai investors is waiting. Robert reached over and pressed the button. Reschedule it, Diane. In fact, clear my calendar for the rest of the week. Victoria looked at him with confusion. What are you doing? Robert picked up the divorce papers and placed them in his desk drawer. I don't know yet, but I think we both deserve more time before we make this final. Robert, I don't want your pity. It's not pity, Victoria. It's... He paused, searching for the right words. It's a recognition that maybe we gave up too easily. Maybe there's still something worth fighting for. Victoria stood, smoothing her dress. You don't have to do this. My health isn't your responsibility. No, Robert agreed, walking toward her. But maybe you still are. 3 days after the postponed divorce signing, Victoria stood in her walk-in closet, methodically packing clothes for her stay at the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Her first round of chemotherapy was scheduled for tomorrow morning. She folded a comfortable cashmere sweater, hands trembling slightly, whether from anxiety or the medication her oncologist had prescribed. She couldn't be sure. The penthouse apartment felt unnervingly quiet. Since purchasing it 2 years ago as their Manhattan residence, it had rarely contained both her and Robert simultaneously for more than a few days at a time. Now, with her imminent hospital stay, the space felt even emptier. Victoria paused, catching her reflection in the full-length mirror. She looked thinner already, though the weight loss had begun before the diagnosis. Dark circles shadowed her eyes despite her careful application of concealer. She'd always taken pride in her appearance, a requirement in New York's high society circles and as Robert Mercer's wife. Soon, the chemo would strip away that control too. The doorbell rang, startling her from her thoughts. Probably the delivery of her prescriptions. She made her way through the spacious living room with its panoramic views of Central Park, a space designed more for impressing guests than for comfort. When she opened the door, Robert stood there, not the pharmacy courier she'd expected. Robert, what are you doing here? He wore casual clothes, jeans and a light sweater, a stark contrast to his usual custom suits. In one hand, he carried a paper bag from Dean and DeLuca, in the other a small suitcase. I thought you might need help packing, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. After all, the apartment was still legally his too. I've got everything under control, Victoria replied automatically. a response that had become her mantra throughout their marriage. Robert set down the bag on the kitchen island. "I brought dinner. That seafood risotto you liked from that place in Soho." The gesture was so unexpected that Victoria didn't know how to respond. When was the last time Robert had brought her dinner? When was the last time they'd eaten together without phones, laptops, or business associates present? "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know." He began unpacking the food, "but I wanted to." They ate at the dining table, an expanse of Italian marble that could seat 12 but rarely hosted more than business associates, or the occasional charity committee meeting. The conversation was stilted at first, careful pleasantries about the weather, a new exhibit at the Met, neutral territory that didn't venture near their crumbling marriage or her diagnosis. "I spoke with Dr. Weiss," Robert said as they finished eating. Victoria set down her fork. "You called my oncologist. I wanted to understand what you're facing." Robert's expression was unreadable. "Why didn't you get a second opinion?" "I did. Dr. Weiss was the second opinion." Robert nodded, absorbing this information. "He said you've opted for the most aggressive treatment protocol. I didn't see the point in half measures." Victoria dabbed her lips with her napkin, a gesture of composure when she felt anything but composed. "He also mentioned you've been coming to all your appointments alone." Victoria shrugged. "As I told you, my sister comes when she can. Amanda has 3 kids and lives in Chicago. How often is when she can?" "Often enough." Victoria stood, collecting their plates. "Robert, why are you really here? You've made your position clear for months. The divorce papers are ready. My illness doesn't change the fact that this marriage hasn't worked for a long time." Robert followed her to the kitchen, leaning against the counter as she loaded the dishwasher, a task their housekeeper usually handled, but Victoria needed the distraction. "Do you remember what you said when I proposed?" he asked suddenly. Victoria paused, a glass suspended in her hand. "That was a long time ago. You said, 'I'm not easy to love, Robert. Are you sure about this?'" She set the glass down carefully. "And you said you were sure. You were wrong." "No." Robert shook his head. "I wasn't wrong. I failed. There's a difference." Victoria closed the dishwasher with more force than necessary. "Does it matter now?" "I think it might." Robert reached for her hand, but she pulled away, moving to wipe down the counter. "I appreciate the dinner and whatever this is," Victoria gestured between them, "but I'm not interested in a guilt-driven reconciliation. I've accepted my diagnosis, and I've accepted that our marriage is over. You should too." Robert's phone rang, the specialized tone he used for important business calls. In the past, he would have answered immediately, no matter the circumstances. This time, he silenced it without looking. "I'm coming with you tomorrow," he said, the statement not a question. "That's not necessary." "Victoria," his voice softened, "let me do this. Not as your husband, if that's what you want, but as someone who still cares what happens to you." The sincerity in his eyes made something inside her waver. How long had it been since Robert had looked at her like that? Since she'd felt like more than an accessory to his success? "Fine," she conceded, "but don't expect this to change anything." The next morning, Victoria woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, she was disoriented. Robert never made coffee. During their marriage, he was either already gone when she woke or waited for their housekeeper to handle such tasks. She found him in the kitchen, dressed in another casual outfit, typing on his laptop while sipping from a mug. "You're still here," she observed, reaching for the coffee he'd poured for her. "I said I'd go with you," he replied without looking up. "Car's coming at 9. Victoria leaned against the counter, studying him. Something had changed in Robert, but she couldn't quite identify what. There was a stillness to him that she hadn't seen in years, maybe ever. The Robert she knew was always in motion, always 3 steps ahead, plotting his next acquisition or expansion. "What about the Shanghai deal?" she asked, knowing it had been consuming his attention for months. "Jason's handling it." Robert closed his laptop. "I've delegated most of my immediate responsibilities." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You? Delegated?" A hint of a smile crossed his face. "Contrary to popular belief, I do know how." "Since when?" "Since my wife told me she has cancer." The bluntness of his statement hung in the air between them. Wife, not soon-to-be ex-wife. The distinction wasn't lost on Victoria. "I'm not using this as a manipulation tactic, Robert. I know that." He stood, moving closer to her. "But it's made me realize something." "What's that?" "That I've been running from things my entire life. Building this empire was just the biggest distraction of all. Victoria set down her mug. That's quite an epiphany to have overnight. It wasn't overnight. It's been coming for a while, he paused. Finding out about your diagnosis just crystallized things. Before she could respond, her phone chimed with a calendar reminder. It was time to prepare for the hospital. At the cancer center, Victoria was struck by how Robert seemed to transform. Gone was the intimidating billionaire who commanded rooms with his presence. Here he was attentive, asking thoughtful questions of the medical staff, taking notes on his phone, and most surprisingly, holding her hand as the oncology nurse explained the procedure. As the nurse inserted the IV that would deliver the chemicals designed to kill the rogue cells in her body, Victoria finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. Why did you want a divorce, Robert? Really? He looked startled by the directness of her question. For a moment, she thought he might offer the same platitudes they'd exchanged during counseling, growing apart, different priorities, the natural evolution of relationships. Instead, he squeezed her hand and said, I was afraid. Of what? Of failing you, of not being what you needed. He looked down at their intertwined fingers. The more successful I became, the more I felt like a fraud. Like someday you'd realize I wasn't worth the sacrifices you made to be with me. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. That's absurd. You're Robert Mercer. Exactly, I'm Robert Mercer, the billionaire, the CEO, the deal maker. But who am I to you? Who am I when all that's stripped away? 4 weeks into Victoria's treatment, their routine had settled into an unexpected rhythm. Robert had moved back into the penthouse, sleeping in the guest room. On chemo days, he accompanied her to the hospital, laptop in hand but rarely opened. On her better days, they took short walks in Central Park, her arm linked through his for support rather than affection. Today was not one of her better days. Victoria lay curled on the bathroom floor, the cool tiles a small comfort against her feverish skin. The nausea had woken her at 3 a.m., violent and unrelenting. She'd tried to be quiet, but Robert had appeared in the doorway minutes later, wordlessly filling a glass of water and sitting on the edge of the bathtub, waiting. For you should go back to sleep, she managed between waves of sickness. Big meeting tomorrow. I rescheduled it, he said simply. Victoria wanted to argue but lacked the strength. This new, patient Robert still felt like a stranger, or perhaps a ghost of the man she'd first fallen in love with, before ambition and success had hardened him. When the worst had passed, he helped her back to bed, bringing a fresh washcloth for her forehead and anti-nausea medication. As he turned to leave, she caught his wrist. Stay, she whispered, just until I fall asleep. He settled into the armchair beside the bed, a silent sentinel in the darkness. Victoria studied his profile, illuminated faintly by the city lights filtering through the curtains. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper now, his shoulders slightly stooped, subtle changes she might not have noticed if they weren't living in such close proximity again. Tell me something real, she said, her voice barely audible. Robert was quiet for so long she thought he might not have heard her. Finally, he spoke. I've been having the dream again, the one about my mother. Victoria knew about the recurring nightmare that had plagued him since childhood, watching helplessly as cancer consumed his mother, his father retreating into work and alcohol, leaving 12-year-old Robert essentially orphaned twice over. Is it because of my diagnosis? Partly. He shifted in the chair. But I think it's also because I've been realizing how much I've become like my father. The confession hung in the air between them, weighted with years of unspoken pain. You're nothing like him, Victoria said firmly. Your father abandoned you when you needed him most. You came back when I needed someone. Did I? Robert's laugh held no humor. Or did I just replace one form of running away with another? Instead of leaving physically, I buried myself in work. The result was the same. Victoria had no answer to that. It was the truth they'd both been circling around for weeks now. Why did you marry me? She asked instead. Robert turned to face her fully. Because you were the first person who saw past all the trappings. You weren't impressed by the money or the power. You challenged me, made me want to be better. And then? And then I forgot what better meant. I started measuring everything in acquisitions and profit margins. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What about you? Why did you marry me? Victoria closed her eyes, remembering. Because beneath that ruthless businessman exterior, I saw someone who secretly wanted to create beautiful things. Someone who got more excited about the design of a new hotel than its projected revenue. I thought we'd build something meaningful together. We still could, Robert said quietly. Before Victoria could respond, exhaustion pulled her under, the conversation fading into troubled dreams. The next morning, Victoria woke to find a bouquet of fresh peonies, her favorite, on the nightstand and a note: "Meeting couldn't be rescheduled after all. Back by dinner." She was simultaneously relieved and disappointed. These past weeks of forced proximity had created a strange limbo, neither married nor divorced, neither strangers nor truly reconciled. Every conversation felt like navigating a minefield of unresolved issues and fresh vulnerabilities. Feeling slightly stronger, Victoria showered and dressed, determined to reclaim some normalcy. Her phone chimed with a text from her sister. "Call me when you can, important," Amanda answered on the first ring. "How are you feeling today?" "Better than yesterday," Victoria replied, settling onto the living room sofa. "What's so important?" There was a pause on the line. "I ran into Patricia Winters at a fundraiser last night." Victoria tensed. Patricia was the wife of James Winters, one of Robert's oldest friends and business associates. "And?" "She mentioned seeing Robert having dinner with Lauren Sullivan 2 weeks ago at 11 Madison Park." The name sent an electric jolt through Victoria. Lauren Sullivan, the brilliant young architect Robert had hired to design his latest hotel project in Miami. Victoria had met her exactly once at a company event 6 months ago, and had immediately noted the way the woman looked at her husband, with admiration that bordered on something more intimate. It was probably business, Victoria said automatically, even as doubt crept in. 2 weeks ago would have been during one of her hospital stays, when Robert had claimed to be working late. Patricia said they looked close. "I'm sorry, Vic. I thought you should know." After hanging up, Victoria sat motionless, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Why did this information hurt so much? They had been on the verge of divorce. She had no claim on Robert's fidelity anymore, had effectively relinquished it when they both agreed their marriage was over. Yet the thought of him with Lauren, young, healthy, vibrant Lauren, while she withered away from chemo, was a special kind of torture. Victoria's phone buzzed again. A text from Robert. "Running late. Don't wait up." Something inside her hardened. Without allowing herself to reconsider, she called for a car and got dressed. If Robert could resume his life, so could she. 90 minutes later, Victoria entered the sleek lobby of Mercer International Holdings. The receptionist's eyes widened in recognition. "Mrs. Mercer, we weren't expecting you. Mr. Mercer is in a meeting right now." "I know," Victoria smiled smoothly. "I'll wait in his office." She moved through the familiar corridors, nodding at startled employees who clearly hadn't expected to see the boss's wife, especially not one supposedly battling cancer. The whispers followed her to the executive floor. Robert's assistant, Diane, nearly dropped her coffee when Victoria approached her desk. "Mrs. Mercer, Mr. Mercer is in the Sullivan presentation and asked not to be disturbed." "The Sullivan presentation?" Victoria kept her voice level. "Lauren Sullivan?" "Yes, for the Miami property. They've been in the conference room all afternoon." "I see." Victoria glanced toward the closed conference room doors. "Actually, I think I'll join them. It's been too long since I've been involved in the business." "But Mrs. Mercer—" Victoria was already pushing open the door. Inside, Robert stood at the head of a long table, surrounded by executives and design team members. At his right hand sat Lauren Sullivan, pointing at architectural renderings projected on the wall. The room fell silent as every head turned toward the interruption. Robert's expression shifted from irritation to shock. "Victoria? Is everything all right?" He moved toward her immediately, concern evident in his face. "Everything's fine," she said, her gaze flicking to Lauren, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I was feeling better and thought I'd see what's kept you so busy lately." Robert guided her to a chair, murmuring, "You should have called. I would have arranged a car." "Clearly I'm interrupting," Victoria said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Please continue, Miss Sullivan. I'm eager to see your vision for my husband's latest project." The meeting resumed with palpable tension. Victoria observed the interactions carefully, searching for evidence of the relationship Patricia had implied. She found nothing obvious. Robert maintained professional distance, addressing Lauren as formally as the other team members. Yet there was something in the way Lauren deferred to Robert, how she seemed to anticipate his questions before he asked them. That suggested a rapport built over many private conversations. When the meeting concluded, Victoria noticed Lauren lingering, clearly hoping for a moment alone with Robert. "Miss Sullivan," Victoria approached her directly. "Your designs are quite impressive. I'd love to hear more about your inspirations sometime." Lauren smiled tightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. That's very kind. Perhaps when you're feeling better?" "I'm feeling fine now, actually." Victoria maintained eye contact. "Well enough to be more involved in my husband's projects going forward." The architect's smile faltered. "Of course. That would be wonderful." After everyone had filed out, Robert closed the door and faced Victoria. "What was that about?" "Patricia Winters saw you having dinner with Lauren at 11 Madison Park 2 weeks ago." Victoria crossed her arms. "When you told me you were working late." Robert's expression remained neutral. "James was there too. It was a business dinner." "Patricia didn't mention James." "Because he arrived late." Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Victoria, whatever you're thinking—" "I don't know what to think anymore," she interrupted. "We're in this strange purgatory, Robert. Not married, not divorced. You're playing the devoted husband during my treatment, but are you? Really?" The hurt in her voice was more revealing than she'd intended. Robert moved closer, his expression softening. "Victoria, there is nothing between me and Lauren Sullivan or anyone else." He reached for her hands, and this time she didn't pull away. "These past weeks with you, they've reminded me of what matters." "Who matters?" She wanted to believe him. God help her, she wanted to trust that the changes in him were genuine, that his commitment to her wasn't just guilt or obligation. "Then why did you—" The office door burst open. Diane stood there, face pale. "Mr. Mercer, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it's urgent. There's been a fire at the Singapore site. 3 workers are hospitalized." Robert's entire demeanor transformed instantly, the businessman taking control. "Get the crisis team on the line. I need to speak with site management immediately." As he turned to his computer, Victoria felt the familiar wall going up between them. This was the Robert she recognized, the man whose identity was inextricably bound to his empire. "You should go home," he told her, already dialing. "This could take all night." Victoria nodded, gathering her purse. Just as she reached the door, Robert called her name. "Victoria, we're not done with this conversation, I promise." She looked back at him, already absorbed in the crisis, already a million miles away from the man who had sat beside her bed in the darkness. "Aren't we?" she asked quietly, and closed the door behind her. Victoria sat in Dr. Weiss's office 3 months after her diagnosis, hands clasped tightly in her lap as she awaited the results of her latest scan. The past 12 weeks had been a blur of treatments, side effects, and a bewildering emotional roller coaster with Robert. After the confrontation in his office, they'd settled into an uneasy truce. Robert had moved back to their Hamptons estate, visiting regularly but maintaining a careful distance. The divorce papers remained unsigned, tucked away in his desk drawer, a suspended sentence neither was ready to execute or dismiss. Dr. Weiss entered, his expression unreadable as he took a seat across from her. "Victoria, I've reviewed your scans." Victoria held her breath. Beside her, Amanda squeezed her hand. Robert had wanted to be here, but Victoria had asked him to stay away. This moment felt too personal, too raw to share with someone whose place in her life remained undefined. "The treatment has been remarkably effective," Dr. Weiss continued. "The tumors have reduced by over 60%, which is better than we anticipated at this stage." Relief flooded through her, though she maintained her composure. "What's the next step?" "We'll continue with the current protocol for another 6 weeks, then reassess. But Victoria," the doctor leaned forward, "this is very good news. You're responding exceptionally well." Outside the hospital, Victoria stood on the sidewalk, letting the September sun warm her face. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something like hope, not just about her prognosis, but about the possibility of a future, whatever shape it might take. "You should call Robert," Amanda said gently. "Whatever's happening between you two, he deserves to know." Victoria nodded, though she made no move to take out her phone. "I will, but there's something I need to do first." That evening, Victoria sat at the dining table in her penthouse, surrounded by papers, financial statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, the documentation of a life intertwined with Robert's. Their prenuptial agreement had been straightforward, designed to protect his business interests, while ensuring she would be well provided for. But Victoria wasn't interested in what she was entitled to take. She was focused on what she wanted to give back. The doorbell rang at precisely 7. Robert was nothing if not punctual. When she opened the door, he stood there with a bouquet of white peonies, her favorite, and an expression of cautious hope. "Amanda called me," he said by way of greeting. "She said your news was good." Victoria accepted the flowers with a nod. "Better than expected. Come in." Robert followed her into the apartment, stopping short when he saw the dining table covered in documents. "What's all this?" "Sit down," she said, gesturing to a chair. "We need to talk." Robert's face tightened. "Are those the divorce papers?" "No." Victoria took a seat across from him. "These are my proposed amendments to our prenuptial agreement." Confusion crossed his features as he cautiously sat down. "Amendments. Victoria, if this is about money..." "It's not about money. Not in the way you think." She pushed a document toward him. "I want to relinquish my claim to the Hamptons estate and the Paris apartment." Robert stared at the paper, then back at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because I've realized something during these past months." Victoria's voice was steady, her gaze direct. "I don't want any part of your life that I haven't truly earned." "Victoria, everything we have, we built together." "Did we?" She cut him off. "When was the last time you asked for my opinion on a business decision? When did we last collaborate on anything meaningful? The truth is, Robert, we stopped being partners long before we stopped being husband and wife." Robert set the document down, studying her with an intensity that reminded her of their early days together, when every conversation felt like a delicious challenge, a meeting of equals. "What are you really saying?" Victoria took a deep breath. "I'm saying I want a clean slate. If we're going to try again, and I'm not saying we should, it needs to be on different terms." "Different how?" "Equal partnership. True collaboration." She met his gaze unflinchingly. "I was as much to blame for the failure of our marriage as you were. I retreated into charity work and social obligations because it was easier than fighting for my place in your world." Robert was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words. "And now? Now I want to build something of my own." Victoria slid another document toward him. "I've been developing a concept for a foundation. Healthcare advocacy for women without insurance or resources. Education initiatives. Research funding." Robert scanned the business plan she'd created, his expression shifting from surprise to admiration. "This is impressive. When did you put this together?" "During chemo sessions. Turns out having poison pumped into your veins gives you perspective on what matters." Victoria allowed herself a small smile. "I want to run this foundation, Robert, not as your wife, not with your name opening doors, but as Victoria Kent, the person I was before I met you." "Oh, you want to use your maiden name?" "Professionally, yes." She watched his reaction carefully. "This isn't about rejecting you. It's about finding myself again." Robert leaned back in his chair, studying her with new eyes. The silence between them was charged with unspoken questions, possibilities hovering just out of reach. Finally he asked, "And where do I fit into this vision of yours?" Victoria stood, moving to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you meant what you said about being afraid of failing me." She turned to face him. "On whether you're willing to take a risk on something you can't control." Robert followed her to the window, standing close enough that she could smell his familiar cologne. "I've spent my entire career taking calculated risks. This isn't a business decision, Robert." Victoria's voice softened. "This is about faith, trust, believing in something you can't quantify on a balance sheet." Outside, the city lights winked against the deepening twilight, thousands of lives intersecting, separating, continuing in their own orbits. For so long, she and Robert had been like two separate planets, their gravitational fields pulling at each other, but their paths diverging. "I have a confession to make," Robert said suddenly. Victoria tensed, bracing herself. "The Singapore fire," he continued. "It wasn't as serious as Diane made it sound that day in my office. One minor injury quickly treated. I let you believe it was worse because I was afraid of the conversation we were having." The admission hung between them, weightier than Victoria had expected. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I don't want any more lies between us, not even small ones." Robert turned to face her fully. "I've had 3 months to think about what matters to me, about who matters. And I realized something while you were fighting for your life. I've spent my entire career building an empire that means nothing if I have no one to share it with." Victoria studied his face, searching for signs of the old Robert, the man who made grand gestures when backed into emotional corners, only to retreat once the crisis had passed. "Words are easy, Robert. Actions, then." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, the divorce papers. With deliberate movements, he tore them in half, then quarters. "I don't want a divorce, Victoria. I want a second chance, a fresh start." "It won't be easy," she warned. "My treatment isn't over. There will be more bad days, and even if I beat this—" "When," he corrected firmly, "when you beat this." "Even then," Victoria continued, "we have years of patterns to break, habits that destroyed us once." Robert reached for her hand, and this time she let him take it. "Then we break them. Together." The conviction in his voice stirred something in Victoria, a cautious hope she'd been afraid to acknowledge. "What about your empire? The deals, the meetings, the constant travel?" "I've been restructuring the company, delegating more, training the executive team to operate without my constant oversight." He smiled ruefully. "Turns out, I'm not as indispensable as I thought." Robert Mercer admitting he's not essential? Now I know the world has turned upside down. They both laughed, and for a moment it felt like the early days of their relationship, when laughter came easily and the future stretched before them, bright with possibility. "I have a proposal," Robert said, his tone turning serious again. "Not a business proposal, a life one." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. When you finish this round of treatment, let's go away. Not to any of our properties or the usual places. Somewhere new, where no one knows us. Just you and me, rediscovering each other outside of all this." He gestured to the penthouse, the view of Manhattan, the trappings of the life they'd built. "Where did you have in mind?" "That small coastal town in Portugal you always talked about visiting. Cascais, right? No business meetings, no charity galas, just us." Victoria felt something shift inside her, a wall crumbling, a door opening to a future she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. "And after Portugal?" "After Portugal, we come back and build something new, your foundation, maybe some projects together, things we both care about. A life that belongs to us, not to Mercer International Holdings." "And if my cancer comes back?" Robert's grip on her hand tightened. "Then we face it, together. No running away, not me through work, not you through independence. We stand and fight side by side." Victoria studied him, this man she had loved, resented, nearly left, and somehow found again in the most unexpected circumstances. The old Robert would have made promises easily, confidently, with the assumption that money and power could fix anything. This new Robert, or perhaps the original Robert she'd glimpsed beneath the billionaire facade years ago, spoke with humility, with the awareness that some things couldn't be controlled or acquired. "I'm still going to use my maiden name for the foundation," she said finally. "Victoria Kent." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Robert replied with a smile, "though I hope you'll keep Mercer in some capacity." "I think I can manage that." He pulled her gently into his arms, careful of her still fragile body. "So, Victoria Kent Mercer, do we have a deal?" Victoria reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that months of worry had etched deeper. "We have a beginning," she corrected. "The deal we'll negotiate day by day." Outside, the first stars appeared in the New York sky, tiny pinpricks of light against the vast darkness. Victoria had always loved this hour. Not quite day, not quite night, but the promise of both ending and beginning. As Robert's lips met hers in a kiss that felt both familiar and entirely new, she allowed herself to believe in that promise again. 6 months later, Victoria stood on the balcony of a small villa overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The Portuguese coast stretched before her, wild and beautiful in the morning light. Behind her, the bedroom door opened as Robert emerged, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The doctor called," he said, handing her one of the mugs. "Your latest tests came back clear." Victoria smiled, breathing in the salt air. "Does that surprise you?" Not at all. He wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. You're the strongest person I know. They stood in comfortable silence, watching fishing boats return to the harbour below. The past half-year had brought challenges they'd faced together: the completion of Victoria's treatment, the launch of her foundation, Robert's careful withdrawal from the day-to-day operations of his company. The real estate agent called about that property we looked at, Robert said, sipping his coffee, the one with the olive grove. And? It's ours if we want it. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. A home in Portugal. That wasn't on either of our 5-year plans. The best things rarely are, Robert replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Victoria thought about the unsigned divorce papers that had once represented the end of their story. How close they had come to walking away from each other. How one sentence, "There's something you should know," had changed everything. Not because her illness had obligated Robert to stay, but because it had forced them both to confront what truly mattered, to rebuild not just their marriage, but themselves. "I love you," she said simply. Robert turned to face her, the morning light illuminating the smile that still, after all this time, made her heart skip. "I love you too. Always have." "Even when you wanted a divorce," she teased. "Especially then." His expression grew serious. "I wanted you to be free of me because I thought that's what would make you happy. I was wrong. We both were." Victoria set down her coffee cup and wrapped both arms around him. "But we got a second chance to get it right." As Robert's lips met hers, Victoria closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the miracle of finding love again when she'd thought it lost forever. Not the fairy tale romance of their early days, but something stronger, truer, tested by fire and forged anew. A love worth fighting for, a life built together brick by careful brick on the foundation of who they truly were. Not billionaire and socialite, but Robert and Victoria. Two people who had nearly lost everything before discovering that what they needed most had been there all along.